All right. Well, I know we have a shorter session today, so I want to give Dr. Bradley as much time as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. So welcome, everybody. So good to have you here with us. Happy Friday. I hope you're having a fabulous summer and have some great plans for the weekend ahead. For those of you who haven't attended one of these sessions yet or don't know me, my name's Christiana Letterman, and I'm the Director of Alumni Relations and Individual Giving here at the Tulane School of Social Work. I'm really pleased to welcome you all to our July session of the Alumni Lunch and Learn series, which is a new initiative that I've created to provide free continuing education credits to our school's alumni base. I'm really excited to be able to offer 4 of these per year, and our next session will be coming up in September. So I'll send out more info about that soon. Also this year, we have our homecoming and reunion celebration, November 11th through 14th, and we'll have an in-person continuing education session here in New Orleans during that. So I hope to see you there. I have actually a survey that I would love if you all could fill out and let me know if you're coming or not, so we know if you're interested or what you might be willing to come to New Orleans for. So I'll drop that in the chat here. So take a moment to send that out. Also, I want to give you a quick overview of Zoom platform in case any of you have forgot how to use it or don't use it very often. For questions for Dr. Bradley today, you can use the Q&A function down at the bottom. Also, you can use the raise hand function if you want to verbally ask your question. And either Carrie Mulder, who's moderating with me today, or myself will enable your voice to be able to come through and ask that person questions, to Dr. Bradley. If you have any issues, you're welcome to chat with the moderators as well, and we'll try to help you through those. So with all that out of the way, welcome again. You're joining us today for Equity at Work, Important Approaches to the Future of Work and Social Work Practice, facilitated by the amazing Dr. Samuel Bradley Jr. Dr. Bradley is an alumni of Tulane School of Social Work. He received both his MSW and DSW from us, so we love him very much, very dear to us. He's now up at Boston College School of Social Work as an assistant professor of macro practice focused on equity, justice, and inclusion, and is particularly passionate about utilizing design thinking as a strategy for developing innovation in higher education, as well as leveraging higher education programs to support community outcomes in marginalized communities. So I'm going to hand it over. Dr. Bradley, thank you so much for facilitating today. The screen is all yours.
Thank you, Christiana. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. So today's talk is entitled Equity at Work, Important Approaches to the Future of Social Work Practice. Today, I'll tell you a little bit about myself and how I kind of fell into this work, and then hopefully give you a little bit more information about approaches to DEI and equity at work practices that I think can be immediately applicable in your work situation. So first, about myself, yes, my name is Samuel Bradley. I am an alumnus of Loyola University, New Orleans. I went to Loyola to study music and psychology. My mom is a retired now registered psychiatric nurse, and my dad was a shelter director where they also ran substance abuse programs. So naturally, as an undergraduate student, I decided I was going to be nothing like them until this big epiphany hit, and I realized I was exactly like them and decided then to go get my master's degree in social work at Tulane University, where I had a great time, and I'm so thankful to them. And then I discovered this really awesome thing called macro practice, which led me to really become interested in organizations and how organizations work. So I started my career after that in the Alumni Relations Office at Loyola University, New Orleans, where we did a lot of small gift giving, community events. I traveled quite a bit to different chapters across the US, and then branched out from there into major gift fundraising. But that's not where I stopped at. While I was doing that work, I knew that I also wanted to continue to do things that supported my community. So I also got involved with the Forum for Equality, which does political advocacy. At that time, both in Louisiana and nationally, there were about 31 states in the country where it was legal to discriminate. So you could, for instance, be married on a Friday and fired on a Monday just for being who you are, a member of the LGBTQ community. I knew that there was something wrong with this, and I became even more interested in learning more about what was happening, what the policy implications were, as well as what the practice implications were for that. So I decided to go back to school and get my DSW. I became really interested in workplace discrimination, really interested in design thinking, which I'll tell you a little bit more about, and really interested in innovation. So one big fast fact about me is that I really am probably the biggest Star Trek fan that you could possibly imagine. So if you want to hit me with some Star Trek trivia in the chat, I bet I could probably answer your question. There's a picture of me on the right hand side from my early days at Loyola University, New Orleans. It's actually Greenville Hall at the corner of St. Charles Avenue and Broadway. Back in the day when I used to go see the barber and wear suits, because I don't wear suits anymore at my house. So on the left is a picture of Forrester B. Washington, who was the second dean of the Atlanta School of Social Work, what we know now as the Clark Atlanta School of Social Work. I'm just going to read a quick quote by him that keeps me inspired. It says, above all, professional training in social work teaches us that we are living in a changing world, in a world which is changing at a faster rate all the time. Training teaches us that social progress is becoming more and more complex. It keeps us from accepting any fixed idea of an established system of social work. We are willing to try new ideas, which will be for the betterment of the human race. We accept no old ideas as gospel. The trained social worker knows that social functions in the past were not considered as social work at all. This quote comes from the early 20th century when social work was just trying to answer the question, who are we as an organization? What do we do? What are our functions? Who is allowed to be a social worker? Who should be joining in on this? And we, I think, owe ourselves an obligation to continue to answer that question, to press to try and answer that question at every turn. I don't know that we should ever expect that we will fully answer that question because to Dean Washington's point, the social problems that we face are complex and they're changing at a fast rate. So the solutions that we apply may change. And that really means that social work needs to be the kind of profession that is not one discipline, but is really many disciplines coming together to tackle the values that we have set before us, values like social justice, which is not maybe I'll do social justice today, maybe I'll do social justice tomorrow. Profession. Our code of ethics calls us to keep social justice centered as an obligation in the work that we do every day. So as I get into talking about equity at work, I just want to bring up a couple of cases to get us oriented to why I'm talking about the workplace. So this is the case of Starbucks in 2018. Two Black men were harassed in a Starbucks in downtown Philadelphia for sitting and waiting to meet with a third friend who had not yet arrived. The gentleman had asked to use the restroom. They were told they could not. They were sitting and waiting for their friend. They were told, eventually that they had to leave, that they were trespassing. One of them was eventually arrested, and eventually their third friend, who was a white man, showed up, and was begging and asking that the friend be let free. This was a clear indication. This went viral on Facebook. It was recorded. This was a clear indication of a misstep by Starbucks. What many of us may remember from that is that as a public relations move, Starbucks then decided that it was going to shut down for a day and engage in diversity training. I'd love to know the outcome of the statistics on that. But this became an important workplace issue. The other case that I would like to bring to mind is the case of France Telecom. And don't be alarmed if you haven't heard of this before. It was, in fact, in France. And it actually was going on for a while in the early to mid 2000s, and the case was actually just partly resolved in 2019. In 2019, three of the executives at France Telecom were convicted of instituting a policy of harassing workers in order to force them to quit. This deliberate scheme ultimately caused the suicide of 35 of their workers. Some of those suicides actually occurred on the grounds of France Telecom itself. Folks were told that they were incompetent, people were bullied, folks were relocated without any kind of warning. So they were told, okay, well, you work here, but we're moving you, hundreds of miles away from your family and friends, and we're doing that without any kind of conversation. And the overall idea when France Telecom took on this decision to do this was really about money. It was really about getting folks off the payroll, but they failed to have that conversation with their workers, and instead instituted this toxic workplace, hoping that people would just decide voluntarily to leave the organization. The Crown Act. The Crown Act was created in 2019 by the Crown Coalition. Crown stands for Creating an Open and Respectful World for Natural Hair. This was done in partnership with then State Senator Holly J. Mitchell of California to ensure protection against discrimination based on race-based hairstyles by extending statutory protection to hair texture and protective styles such as braids, locks, twists, and knots in the workplace. Many workplaces, and this was in California, and this act has taken on. There's some folks who are interested in moving it forward in New York and New Jersey, and hopefully we'll see it move forward in other places. It's really meant to protect Black women in the workplace who've been harassed because of their hair, the texture of their hair, something they were simply born with. So I just kind of like to be funny sometimes, and so this is a Looney Tunes. I don't know if any of you watched cartoons growing up, but I did. And the up on the left is Fred and Sam, the sheepdogs who chase after the coyote. That's not Wile E. Coyote, just to be clear. And I know that I can't remember his name actually, but if anyone can remember his name, please feel free to put that in the chat. But that's them clocking in and out of work. Right. And I partly put this up here because what a great illustration Looney Tunes is to remind us of how wacky really work can be sometimes. The idea here is that we all simply need to work, right? I mean, unless you're very wealthy or you've been secured in some other way, many of us, 150 million Americans in this country, need to go to work. Work provides a stable outlet that is recreational, but even more so than that, work is a paycheck, right? It keeps a roof over our head, food for us to eat, our car to drive. It really takes care of us and sustains us. So no matter how sort of wacky things are, many of us have to do it. So why my focus on work? I think in a lot of ways for us, the COVID-19 pandemic has highlighted the inequitable conditions that we take for granted as normal in the workplace, i.e. essential workers who were told to show up in the face of really dangerous working conditions without any additional compensation or pay, or any kind of conversation about what that could mean for them and the many people that they live with in their home. And in particular, women, people of color, face discriminations that are not equitable, circumstances that are not equitable. And then this inequity is embedded in the very structure of work itself. And I'll talk more about what that means to have a structure of work. McKinsey and Company research has shown that diversity can actually help organizations do things like increase innovation, reconsider entrenched ways of thinking, and improve financial performance. It's actually been shown that more diverse teams are better at creating products that are more specific and targeted to certain markets, and as a result are also able to target the outcome. They're able to reach that market and communicate with them better. So there's some real benefit to diversity, equity, and inclusion beyond helping workers feel more engaged in the workplace, which is also important.
Sam, I'm going to jump in right here. We have Kia Norman who raised their hand, so I'm going to allow them to talk and ask their question.
Excellent. Love to hear it. Hi, Kia. Kia, can you hear us?
Sorry, it was a mistake. I didn't mean to raise my hand.
Oh, no worries. Listen, if you do have a question, feel free to throw that hand up. I'm absolutely happy to answer any questions at any time. And also, thanks for coming to the talk. So, how might we make work more equitable? I'm going to talk about organizational justice as a really important organizing framework for the interventions that we oftentimes plan in our diversity, equity, and inclusion committees. Many social workers, I don't have any stats on this, but it's more anecdotal, but I bump into social workers all the time who tell me, I'm on my diversity, equity, and inclusion committee, and we're trying to figure out what to do next. We're trying to figure out how to get started. How do we go about this? And one of the things that I tell my students and folks that I work with is you need an organizing framework, right? Like you need a set of ideas that help you bring everything together, because otherwise you're just kind of gonna be floating adrift, right? And I think for many of us, we know that this is important. For instance, even in the practice of psychotherapy, we choose organizing frameworks oftentimes to help us understand how we might do our work. We think of psychodynamic theory, or we think of cognitive behavioral theory, right? And we latch onto those things as ways for us to understand our interactions with our client. This is no different. This is just a way for us to talk about justice in a way that helps us to wrap it around an organization itself. So when I talk about justice, what I'm really talking about is a sense of fairness, and that means our perceptions of fairness, right? Justice, I think many of us as social workers know, is not confined to necessarily what the law says, right? If that were the case, we would only, be pursuing justice when something bad has happened. But in the interim, before we get there, there's a justice to the way that we interact with each other in terms of treating each other with fairness and with dignity. So on the bottom right is a picture of the Justice League, which for me looks like a bunch of social workers getting ready to go off and do good work at the workplace. So I'm going to get into these concepts around distributive, procedural, interaction, informational justice. Feel free to shoot your hand up, and I'm happy to answer any questions as I talk about it. As I go further down, I think some of this will start to make more sense. But let's keep those cases in mind that we had earlier as we think about these different concepts. So distributive justice is simply an idea around, it refers to employees' perceptions of fairness of the outcome, right? So when we talk about distributive justice, what we're really talking about are things like the fair pay in gender gap, which for instance, Gap Inc. is doing some good stuff around. For us to be thinking about if two people are starting in the same place at the same time, how can we ensure that they have a fair outcome amongst the two of them or the entire organization? And I see there's a question in the chat. Oh, that's been answered.
Oh, that was just a question regarding if this session will be recorded and available later, and the answer is yes. We're recording it and it will be available on our YouTube channel probably in just a few days. So we can send that out to you all as well.
Thanks a lot. And I also noticed that somebody asked about potential handout. I'm more than happy to share these slides as well. More than happy to do that. So procedural justice is the idea of the fairness of a process itself, where we all held to the same standards. Was anyone given a chance? One of the things that we're talking about when we're talking about procedural justice is, okay, I'd like to, for instance, make a complaint. Something happened in the workplace that I didn't like. Do we have a documented process for how to do that? And do we follow it, so that when we have two different people who are going through some sort of issue in the workplace, are they able to go through a similar process for a way that we're able to resolve complaints and restore justice? informational justice is actually the fairness of access to the information that's needed for work to be productive and for procedures to be followed. So for instance, now that I've said, do we have a process that we follow? I don't know if any of you have ever had the experience of asking someone a question and their first answer is like, oh yeah, we got that. And then you look under the hood and then it's like, actually, they don't really got that. So I think, probably many of us have shown up to a workplace before we said, okay, like I need how do I go about requesting a raise? How do I go about, putting my name in the hat for a position that's within this organization? How do I make a complaint about something that's happened to me? Oh yeah, we got processes for that. We got like, okay, all right, great, bet, show it to me. Can't find it. Not written down anywhere. Not available. This is what we would refer to as an injustice in terms of informational, right? Like we don't have access to the information that we need in order to make good decisions at work. And interactional justice is really about, and this is my favorite concept to talk about, it's really about the concept of treating each other kindly, treating each other with dignity and respect. You don't necessarily have to have approved of something that I did, or if I did something that was against company policy at work. You can still treat me with dignity and respect, albeit there will likely be a sanction or outcome based off the fact that I did something I really wasn't supposed to do. So let's have a conversation about that. This really shows up, if any of you have ever been in a workplace before, I have, where folks have gotten irritated at one another and they started screaming and shouting at one another. They've broken down in communications. That is an example of how we can lose the sense of justice, our sense of dignity and respect towards one another in the workplace. And of course, on the right, I have Sister Aretha Franklin, who's singing "Respect for All of Us." I love talking about this because it's oftentimes not the way that we talk about justice. We typically talk about justice as in somebody did something wrong, they were sanctioned, or they weren't even sanctioned at all, right? So nothing happened, or they were sanctioned, and they were punished, and that's the end. So when we think about this as a continuum, when something happens in the workplace, how do we ensure in that continuum that we are restoring dignity and respect for all parties? That's important for us to really consider. So in addition to all of that, I'd like to bring to our attention how we might rethink the structure of work itself. And when I say this is a way of us getting even more meta about work. The question is when work gets done, where work gets done, how work gets done. Are organizational employees allowed to have some control over the elements of how the job works in terms of the job structure itself? Can they negotiate those things? Oftentimes we see either it's a full-time salary position or it's part-time. Is there any way that we can rethink how we do that? And when we really talk about inequities built into work structures, really think of the fact that, for instance, many times a salaried employee's per hourly pay is actually higher than an hourly employee's pay who's actually doing the same job. So this is what I mean by inequities that are baked into the structure of work itself. Must work be 8 hours in a day and 5 days a week? Or could we rethink that into 3-day work weeks and something that worked for the particular employee that we're hiring based off of the needs of the organization and a conversation between the employee and the organization itself? This is not easy. We've been entrenched in a culture of the 8-hour workday where you work 8 hours, you get 8 hours for recreation, 8 hours for sleep, and show back up to work, right? And that was in large part a part of the Industrial Revolution. But times have changed since then. We've switched centuries from 20th century to the 21st. The way that work happens has shifted with that. And so we should ask ourselves some really important questions about whether or not we should continue in that pattern. I think many social workers know this because oftentimes many of us are doing groups and continuing to meet with clients after 5 o'clock. So now what? The role of social work. I believe it's my argument today that many social workers are already deeply involved in diversity, equity, and inclusion committees at their own workplace. And many social workers have skill sets that help to facilitate this work. Things like building rapport, performing assessments in complex political and social environments, a deep understanding of human behavior in the social environment, creative problem solving skills, oftentimes without a whole lot of resources. So if we figure out how to put things together with chewing gum and duct tape sometimes, and a high degree of flexibility of the implementation of those new projects. We figure out how to get things done. We're the people who oftentimes bring solutions to really complex and sticky problems that exist out there. So I think that we can rise to this challenge. So I want to talk about building a meaningful DEI scope of practice in your workplace. And my very first, people come to me and they say, you know, I really am interested in doing anti-racist work. I'm really interested in getting involved in LGBTQ organizing, or, you know, I want to start something at work, but like, you know, I don't know what to do. And I always ask them, you know, I say, who do you know who is also interested in doing that work in your workplace? And this is something that social workers do naturally, but this conversation comes up many, many times. And the very first thing I can tell you is, if you're getting ready to do any kind of justice work, any kind of activism, any kind of organizing, the very first thing that I ask you to do for your own benefit and the benefit of others is to see who's already out there maybe doing that work, and to begin the process of building a coalition, both inside your organization and outside. It's hard pursuing change and creating something new, for us to turn our thoughts into things. That's work. And in order for us to do that, we have to bind our energies together in order to really get that done. So then we can, I'd like to also challenge these coalitions to consider if the aim of the organization is even being met. So in the face of, for so many of us working at nonprofits, very mission-driven organizations, for us to consider if we're not fulfilling that justice piece internally, there could be a good bet that we're also not fulfilling that justice mission externally, right? And because we're seeing in the research an increased connection between more diverse teams and these ideas around organizational justice, the ideas of increased effectiveness for products and services and enhanced innovation, they turns out they really matter. That the way that workers interact with one another and how well workers are treated is actually bleeding over into how well we're delivering services for our clients. So I propose a radical DEI that is also about, you know, upgrading our skills and knowledge. It's about treating each other better and well, but also we're taking a long look at the way that our DEI can actually impact things like the services that we provide. So an example at Boston College is we're very concerned with the ways that we treat each other, and we're thinking through those. How do we interact in the classroom and in the hallways, right? And at the same time, we're also taking a very meaningful moment to think about, okay, so what are we doing in the curriculum? Who are we reading in the curriculum? Who gets a voice here, right? We talk about epistemic justice. Whose knowledge is favored over others, right? And really thinking through that so that we can provide justice in more than one level throughout the organization. Speaking of BC, this Tulanean is going to give a little shout out to some work that we've done at Boston College School of Social Work, which is the creation of a certificate called Leaders for Equity and Justice in the Workplace. The certificate includes learning modules focused on organizational justice. Our students are actually taking a class just this summer in this topic, and next week they'll be presenting some solutions that they've been working on through several of the cases. Some of them are ones I've mentioned already, you know, and they'll also be taking courses on conflict resolution and mediation skills, leadership development, design thinking, which is one of my favorite things to talk about, and community-based systems dynamics, which is a problem-solving technique in research. The answer is no. I know some of you are wondering, Can I get the certificate? Not yet, but maybe. Bear with me as we work towards making it continuing education. But one of the reasons why this is so important to me is because I think as social workers, we can really lead well in this area. We have many of the skills and techniques that we need already, and we're just simply adding in a strong analysis and a few more techniques and skills to get the work done. So I know many of us come to CEUs and we think, all right, that's great, Teach, but like, what can you tell me about my workplace? Ultimately, many of the solutions for your work community will be exclusive to your specific work culture, and that's important because you need to engage everyone at that work, at that place, that organization, in the process of building something together. That is just, floor level, really important to think of. There's a long history of folks marching into organizations and deciding all the changes that are going to be made, and they don't engage the employees. And guess what? It ends up usually with a lot of churn, so employee turnover, and a lot of low worker engagement. So it's really important to build those things in coalition, like I was mentioning before, together. The next thing is I would set out by building a set of community agreements within the coalition that you're working with. Those community agreements that can establish expected work culture around things like meetings, mistakes that happen, brainstorming sessions. And again, this is a really important question about who gets to get heard when problems arise in the workplace, when things go wrong. How will we handle those things? I gotta blow your mind for a second. Things will go wrong in your work culture. I talk to folks and I say, all right, what problem are we attempting to solve? And people will say, like, we don't have a problem here. There's no problem. Everything's fine. Everything's fine. Now, if I went in and I said, how are financials going? Folks can oftentimes step back with a way more kind of articulate and cold and objective viewpoint, like, oh, well, we're down 5% this quarter, so we're going to create this new revenue structure and offer this new service, and we think we'll be back on track next year, done, out the door. When I come in and I say, what is the state of diversity, equity, and inclusion? Oh, we're good, we're great, we're good. Don't come over here. Like, all right, but you invited me into this conference room. I know, but just to tell you that we're great, how great we are. We're just gonna let you know that. I'm gonna tell you immediately that I don't believe that, and I don't think that there's anything wrong with having a problem. We as social workers, that's our bread and butter. We deal with problems in complex systems. So we should never be afraid to admit to ourselves that problems are going to arise. And when, not if, but when they do, we should talk about how we're going to tackle those things. Not only the problem that we're trying to tackle in terms of our mission, but the interpersonal problems that will inevitably rise from workplace disagreements, from missteps and miscommunication. Many of us work hard to avoid those things, and yet we oftentimes know, they just arise out of many different places. So let's come up with some strategies early, preventative, so that we can talk about what we're going to do in the face of those missteps when they occur. How do we restore dignity and respect? How do we restore procedure, outcomes? How do we restore the information and knowledge that had once been missed? These are important places. It's not something that we gloss over and fly through. It's something that we say, like, hey, I acknowledge there was a misstep here. We should create spaces. This is beyond organizational justice, I guess, but we should create public spaces for forgiveness and for restoration. But I'm going to get off my hobby horse and move on. If you haven't done so already, I would definitely go ahead and establish a grievance policy for when things will go wrong. Articulate who employees should go to, the process for dealing with complaints, and who will make decisions. Ensure that employees have access to this information. You'd be surprised how many places don't have a written down grievance policy, how many people don't know who's involved in making the final decision, how many people don't get a restored justice in the workplace after a problem has occurred. We really need to be thinking, beyond the legal liability. We need to include that, obviously, but beyond that, into how do we restore the sense of justice within an organization that we work in. We should also be paying attention to who is not involved in decisions. We should be asking ourselves, what is the structure of our organization? And does it actually prohibit communication, or does it help to ease the flow of communication? Individual employees cannot necessarily fix a system problem. That's why we do it in groups and coalitions. We work across silos to make that possible. Might it even benefit us to reorganize so that information is not so siloed? Thinking about teams that come from interdisciplinary places. Okay, we need to establish a new service. Let's get accounting and grants, and let's get clinical, and let's get fundraising. Let's get everybody in the same room and talk about what that's going to look like. So just a couple of final thoughts. Social workers should focus on the workplace and organizational justice. It's what my grandmother would call a charge to keep. We've been charged to think about social justice. It is one of our pillars in our code of ethics, and it's required of us to think, about not just our external clients, not just the one-on-one clients that we're seeing, but the organizations that we work in themselves. Diversity, equity, and inclusion may be key to unlocking powerful results with regards to work engagement, effectiveness of service, and leadership development. And each and every one of us can play a role in making the workplace more equitable, just and inclusive. We might be in different levels in the organization, but every single one of us can keep this at the forefront of the way that we interact with one another in the workplace. And more largely, we have the power to rethink work and work structures. It has happened before in American life, and it can happen again. I'm specifically thinking of Frances Perkins, who was, I want to say she was the first female Secretary of Labor under Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Social workers have been intimately involved with workplace administration. I really like looking up the history of places where I've been at. And so I'd be interested in doing this at Tulane, Christiana, but I did this at Boston College. I pulled their first year course catalog from 1937. And if you can believe it, there it was in black and white, 2 courses on workplace. One was called Workplace Administration, and the other one was called Labor Relations. And I bet if I go look at the ones at Tulane, they would tell me all the way back, to the 20s, and they would show me very similar courses that have always existed as a part of our history. So please don't forget that we have the power to make real meaningful, sustained impact for the future of all workers in front of us. And so with that, I just want to thank Tulane for having me. I want to thank the Tulane Alumni Association for being so generous in supporting alumni for volunteering, Christiana for getting us organized, Carrie for handling the technical aspects for the work that we're doing, Dean Bortnick for his leadership, and all of my many Tulane faculty and staff. I see you, and I'm so thankful for everything that you've done. If I don't get a chance to ever stand in front of this group before, I just want to say how proud I am to be a part of this community. Thanks a lot.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sam. So I think we should open it up to our audience. If we have any questions, thoughts, comments. We did have a note from Jocelyn that says, it's interesting. She was talking about grievance policies and says, it's interesting because we always have grievance policies for clients, but not for staff. The preventative approach is such a great perspective. Thank you for sharing that. Which I think that's very accurate, right? And maybe you could talk a little bit more about your perspective on how organizations can implement those and how we as staff can bring those to the table.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for asking that question. So, there are workplace protections, and folks should know what those are on the federal and state level. So all of you can take a moment, go run off to your Google machines and check and see what protections exist in your states and the federal policy. The 1965 Civil Rights Act is where I would start at. I really think that it's important that we all know that we sometimes are under the impression that we have more protections than we actually do at work, which is one of the reasons why it's so important to install a policy and really think about what that is going to say about the organization that we work at. How do we take care of each other, right? And I would convene a commission, a committee, and get folks together and put together. It need not be more than a couple of paragraphs explaining, all right, here are the kinds of problems that may arise at work. Here's the procedure for how someone can make a complaint, and here is how that complaint will be held. Here's who will see it. Here's who will talk about it, and then here's how decisions will be made on the other side of it. And that could include, the thing that everyone goes to is like, I'm going to get fired, and maybe you will. But in addition to that, we should be talking about, okay, well, how do we restore relationships between maybe the person who did the incident, who performed the violation, and the person who's been aggrieved. Now, I'm not asking anybody to sort of stand in the way of being hurt. If you're being hurt or someone is hurting you, please get out of the way. Do what you have to do to take care of yourself. But we know that things happen, right? That we should be working towards thinking, okay, well, how do we handle this problem? And oftentimes what you see, so I should warn all of you who are going to run off to your bosses and talk about, installing a grievance process, is when you do put it forward, there's usually like a lightning upshoot of like grievances that are put in, and those will happen. But then I fully anticipate that will actually start to smooth out as we continue to work towards. Then we know we have a problem, right? Like then we can start training folks and thinking about what specific needs what we need to be pushing out in order to deal with those. What kinds of trainings do we need to be doing so folks know maybe beforehand when they first start working there? Here's who we are. We don't tolerate this kind of this kind of behavior in the workplace. So really stepping forward and putting that policy out, it's not enough to pretend like those things don't happen. And I think, recognizing it and taking a preventative approach to it is the best resolution that you can really hope for.
All right, we have a couple more questions. The first is from Avery. And the question is, what frameworks can you suggest for formal restorative practices for workplaces?
Great question. We're actually talking a little bit at Boston College right now about restorative justice approaches. So, really, and I'm not an expert in this area, but really thinking through, one, how do we ensure that people stay safe, right? That we ensure that, we have a healthy community. But also, things happen all the time in places like classrooms or in the office where people make missteps. They say things that they didn't know was inappropriate, or they do things. Now, I want to also said this, I was having a conversation with a buddy last night, and we were talking about mindfulness in social justice practice. If you're interested in anything like that, I would check out Rhonda McGee's book, Racial Justice and Mindfulness. And he said, well, what about like explicit bias, like these acts where somebody is absolutely discriminating? And I said, well, we're not going to try to be mindful and like teach people to like, to just deal with or handle folks who further discrimination. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about implicit bias. I performed this thing and I had no clue that it would be, offensive to you. I might have reached out and touched you, for instance. I gave you a hug or I gave you a handshake. I didn't realize that might trigger you or trigger someone else. And I'm using that example, knowing full well that many social workers are aware of that. But not all of us work exclusively with social workers, So then in the face of that, we should really stop and acknowledge that, a problem has occurred. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to offend you. And move from that into how do we restore the relationship? because it's not going to be sufficient that two employees just never speak to each other ever again. That's how we create dysfunctional and toxic workplaces. And that's hard, y'all. That is real work. That is social work.
All right. Next question is from Kalitha. And it says, is there any specific reason why women, especially people of color, face circumstances that aren't equitable in the workplace?
The structure of racism. And I would even take it back a little bit to talk about Heather Cox Richardson has a really great book called How the South Won the Civil War. And I'm blanking on other references. Actually, another good one could be Resma Minicum's book, My Grandmother's Hands. And he talks about how we pass trauma down, we blow trauma through generations of folks. In other words, we really are performing these actions and behaviors over and over again, and we're causing harm to each other, right? And the only way to do that is to stop and acknowledge, to recognize that work and go from there. I would also argue that an unregulated capitalist system is exactly going to exploit other folks. And so, creating more federal workplace protections is probably the best place to go to make sure that folks are safe and healthy and comfortable and happy in the workplace. Because again, we all got to do it, or many of us have to do it. And so in the face of that, we should create a work situation that is equitable for all of us. But yeah, structural racism is real. So make sure you have a cogent analysis around that too, please.
All right. If anybody else has questions, please ask. I have a question of my own that I'd be curious to hear from you on. So in larger organizations, we often have a large grouping of sort of generations, right? Different generations, different experiences, different perspectives on DEI and how we implement them. How do we all come to the table and work together to move forward? What are some best practices there?
We really need to. So, I love the idea of affinity groups. So really creating in-house affinity groups where folks are able to gather and provide support with one another, talk about issues that are coming up, and then they're able to gather together as a group and really advance that information, up through the pipeline and to the appropriate offices where that needs to happen. So for instance, some larger organizations have, a women's affinity group where folks are able to come together and say, like, these are the issues that we're seeing, in the workplace, and we'd like to advance that onto the leadership, and then you've got, every woman in that organization is backing up this play, saying like, here's an issue that we're trying to solve for, and it's going to make us better workers if we solve it, right? And then ultimately, I would say that each department should be thinking locally about their role in diversity, equity, and inclusion. At the very least, employees should be productive. In order to be productive, they must be engaged well, which means they need to feel safe, and things need to be made clear to them. And as they're working in that local context, always continuing to come up to the larger context of the full organization itself. So that means maybe having a rotating chair who is doing the chairing the DE&I work at the local committee in that department, and then maybe one representative goes off to the larger DEI committee for the larger university. And so then we're continuing to always share information, and we're not siloing ourselves. I'm thinking about higher education, but this really does work across a variety of different sectors. So I'm thinking like, okay, chemistry is doing that, and that's really good for me to keep my my ear to the ground and see how they handle it. So maybe they can teach us a lesson about how we can do something in our area. Can I answer your question? And the truth is that like, there are some people who are going to say to you, I don't get it. And I, one of the things that I've learned is I oftentimes, there are folks, and this is a burgeoning area that I do talk about a little bit. There are folks who do executive coaching in this area. for DEI. I note that many social workers are starting to add this to part of their practice, and really talking to folks through this who want to learn and do more. We just need to make sure that we're doing our own work, right, folks? So before you go rush off and you ask your friend or me for their book list, that there are lots of books that you can Google and find and listen to on Audible, you know, and look up on Amazon, and lots of book lists out there, you know, and it is especially important for me to say that it is not women and people of color, it's not their job to teach you how to be anti-racist. Like, you have to do that work. And so I try not to really get too bogged down in thinking to myself, you know, well, what if, you know, such and such, you know, what are they going to think about it? Fine. I don't really think about them too much. I think to myself, in the work that I do at Boston College, I want you to get an email about DEI once a week. I want to have a DEI banner hanging above the doorway when you walk in. I want, you know, there to be awards around DEI. I want it to be a part of the Alumni Association's work, the library's work, and everybody else's work. Because I bet if I go looking, a lot of people really do care about that. So much so that, like, if you're a hater and you don't want to be involved in it, guess what? You can't get out. You know, we've incentivized the workplace around equity, justice, and inclusion.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It's, you know, each of us doing the work actively. Tulane just hired this past year Dr. Annalise Singh as the university's first diversity officer. And she actually has an incredible workbook that, if you don't know about, I highly recommend. It's called the Racial Healing Handbook. And it's a whole handbook of learning and thinking about your experience and applying, you know, DEI techniques. So an incredible piece of Tulane connection that we have there as well.
That's awesome. I've heard of some really great stuff happening at Tulane, which is exciting. And I have actually been meaning to get a hold of that book.
And we have one more comment that I want to share before we end today. This is from Chanel, and it says, Dr. Bradley, thank you so much. Perfect timing. So much, if not all of the information and concept you shared today resonate with me as a TSSW alum and current law student. Congrats on that. This workshop precisely describes my interest in labor and employment law. Thank you.
Awesome. Keep going.
All right. Well, if there are no more questions today, I want to thank Dr. Bradley again for joining us and sharing this important information. It's always such a joy to have you present and to be with you. So thank you. For all of you waiting on certificates, I will be putting those together in the next couple of weeks and sending you those via email that you logged in with today. So be sure to check that. And if you don't get it, feel free to reach out to me. Happy to resend that to you as well. So go off, have a fabulous Friday, a fabulous weekend, and we'll see you again in September.